Let's move on now to this little reading on investing in commodities. And this is actually an interesting reading, and of course, like all readings, it makes a number of points, and there's some things we need to talk about and all that sort of stuff. But there's one thing in particular that I think you ought to pay attention to, and that's this idea of a roll yield, what it is, why it may be valuable, and when it's going to be positive, when it's going to be negative. And we're going to see there's going to be some differences here with the way we describe this as opposed to what we've talked about in other places in the curriculum. So it does require just a little bit of care, but the intuition here is pretty simple. There's not really any calculations. It's just a matter of understanding the argument that is being made. So I think you'll find this to be fairly straightforward. All right, so as we have discussed elsewhere in the curriculum, we've talked about this notion of the relative value of the spot prices and futures prices. Okay, so we're talking about when we've used the word contango to mean the futures price is above the spot, and that is in fact what contango means. Now we have described that elsewhere in terms of what is called a convenience yield. So we looked at a pricing function and we considered storage costs, and we talked about the existence of convenience yield. We said if convenience yield is small, then the contango is going to be big. Okay, convenience yield isn't part of this reading, so let's not even think in terms of convenience yield. So let's just for the moment think about the relationship between the spot and the futures price as a function of the who is hedging in the underlying market, or who's hedging the underlying commodity. So when we think of people who are long hedgers, this is users of the commodity. So again, if we resort back to my normal commodity, that is wheat, then we think a long hedger, that's someone who uses wheat in their production process. It's a cereal company. So the cereal company says, all right, I've got input to my production process. Okay, part of that is going to be wheat. I want to hedge away any price fluctuation so I know exactly what my cost of goods sold are going to be through time. So they are going to buy wheat in the futures contract. That is to say, they are going to be long in the futures contract, and we call those people long hedgers. Well, if you are long, then of course you're buying, and buying means you're increasing demand, and that's going to drive up price on the margin, right? So if we look at a commodity contract, so we're looking at a commodities derivative like a derivative on wheat, a wheat futures contract. Well, if we have long hedgers as the dominant hedgers in the market, okay, well, they may be willing to pay a premium for the benefit of hedging. Okay, so they want to take a long position, so they're more worried about putting off risk than they are worried about maybe having a slightly higher price in the commodity. So if we have all of the hedgers are long, then we're going to have a market that is in contango. Now, of course, we could overlay this with the idea of storage costs, and we could add in convenience yield as we've seen everywhere else. But let's just think about supply and demand here. So in this case, long hedgers are buying. If you get everyone buying, then you're going to have to attract in short hedgers, not short hedgers. You're going to have to attract people in on the short side. If there's no hedgers there to naturally take those positions, then you're going to have to attract in speculators, and to do that, you're likely to have to bid up the price. You're going to be willing to buy at a higher price. So contango is going to be a characteristic of a market where the long hedgers, the people on the long side of the contracts, are the dominant force. Okay. On the other hand, if you have a market where it is the producers of the economy that are the dominant players, they're the dominant hedger or hedging structure there, then that's going to be a market that is in backwardation. So if you got a farmer with wheat in the field, they're long in the spot market, they got all that wheat out there, right? So they're going to want to short in the futures market, so they're going to be selling. Well, if the dominant influence, or the marginal influence, I guess maybe a way to say that, the marginal influence here is going to be these producers of the underlying commodities that want to hedge price risk for their finished goods, then they're going to be doing a lot of selling. If you do a lot of selling, well, that's going to drive down that future price, and the futures price is going to be below the spot price, and that's what we're going to call a market in backwardation. So we've talked about this in a couple of dimensions. We looked at the convenience yield previously, okay, but now we're doing this as an argument in supply and demand. I would suggest you segment those and follow the supply and demand argument here. So the market can be in contango, the market can be in backwardation. Okay, so what does that mean for us? Well, if you were talking about investing in commodities, which is the title of the reading, then we're going to have these different sources of risk and return that are going to come with this. And the return, as we're going to see in the next slide, is going to be influenced by whether the market is in backwardation or is in contango. So risk, of course, if we're thinking of sources of risk and return for investing in commodities, well, long exposure to a commodity is going to be achieved, again, through this derivative. It could be a forward or a futures, this is a fairly efficient way. So what the underlying reading says is that for some commodities, it's more efficient to access the underlying price movement through derivatives. I would challenge the author of that statement to say, tell me where there is a commodity product where it's not more efficient to use derivatives. But anyway, so the statement's obviously true. I just don't think it's strong enough. So we have this long exposure to the commodity, and that's going to give us price risk, right? So if we think that the price of the goods going up, then we're going to be long in the underlying, and that's going to, if the price of the underlying falls, then we're going to lose. If the price of underlying goes up, then we're going to win, just like we would with anything else. And we don't know which is going to be the direction of price move. So there's the normal risk associated with the price movement of the futures contract. But if we want to talk about return, and we're talking about either a collateralized commodity future where we're buying a T-bill that's going to mature at the same time as the futures contract expires and is going to have a face value equal to our obligation to buy the underlying commodity. So if we're buying, $10,000 worth of wheat in the future, then we'd have a T-bill that matures at the same time with a face value of $10,000. That would be part of a strategy. That'd be a collateralized commodity future. We're going to enter the futures contract and we're going to buy a T-bill. But even if we're not doing that, we still have to put up some sort of margin, right? So this is the idea that we've got to put up something to say that we can handle losses if we were to incur those. And one way to do that would be to put up, a T-bill or something else. Well, if you do that, you're going to have some collateral yield. So either way, there's going to be a collateral yield. Okay, so that's one source of return from investing in commodities. Then there's the price return. That is, all right, I entered a futures contract. The price, I'm long the futures contract. The price ended up above the futures contract. I have a gain. Below the futures contract, I have a loss. That's the normal thing, right? So we talked about that in the derivative section. We go over it in a lot of detail. So it's just price return, whatever that happens to be. I don't find that very interesting in terms of what this reading is getting to. So I think what you ought to focus on here is this idea of a roll yield. Okay, so when we talk about a roll yield, what we mean is, look, this is basically an active strategy. So because, since futures contracts aren't perpetual, we never get to the expiration date, so that would make them meaningless. That means that we're going to come to an expiration date and we're going to realize some return. Well, if the market is in contango versus the market being in backwardation, we're going to have different probabilities of having a positive and negative roll yield. So let me explain maybe a little bit more about what I mean here. And I think that understanding this is key to understanding this reading. So if we thought of this as, maybe time here on the horizontal axis, and we'll think in terms of dollars up here on the vertical axis. Well, we've got a spot price, right? So the spot price is what it is, and we're going to say it's equal to $10 just as a number. And the spot price is I'm going to assume for this little graphic, since what we're talking about is the roll yield, not the price return, is that the spot price is constant. So we know the spot prices aren't constant, right? So a spot price could go something like this. So we know that could happen. That portion of it is what we refer to as price return. Here we're talking about roll yield. So if we're looking at the normal market, right, and we're assuming the spot price is constant through time so that we have some sort of outsized influence from the hedgers. So all the hedgers are on one side. So all the hedgers are on the long side. That is, they're the serial companies that are hedging long so that they can control the variation in their cost of goods. Well, in that case, we have lots of demand, so the futures price here is going to be higher than the spot price. So it's going to be up here, and we'll call it 11. Of course, the difference between 10 and 11 will be huge. But nonetheless, we've got a futures price that is in an outsized way, more than what we would think the interest rate would be, that sort of stuff, in an outsized way above the spot price. Well, what does that imply for the holder of this commodity? Or for this commodity investor might be a better way to say it. So, well, in this case, if we assume that the spot price is going to be constant, well, if this is the expiration of the contract over here, okay, so that's the expiration date, then we know that as we get close to expiration, then these two things are going to have to converge. Okay, so what's going to happen is this. So we have someone who is entering a contract on the long side. They're agreeing to buy at 11, and then when they get to the point where they have to roll over the contract, that's why we call it the roll yield, then they're buying for 11 and the spot price is 10. Do you like to be in a market or in a situation where you have to take something that's worth $10 and pay $11 for it? Well, no, you don't. And then, of course, what they have to do is they have to do that all over again. So we're going to have another follow-on to that on the other side. So that would be a market that was in contango, right? The futures price is greater than the spot price. But what about a market that is in backwardation? So in this case, we have a situation where not all of the hedgers, but the dominant force from the hedging side is the producers of the underlying commodities. So if you have the producers of the underlying commodities being the marginal player, then all else equal, they're driving the futures price down, so that the futures price here in this backwardized market might only be 9. Of course, 9, 10, 11 is really, really big, so we're not looking for effects that big. But nonetheless, that would tells the right story. At least the directional impact is right. So now, if we have this market that is in backwardation, then we've got these futures prices that are below the spot prices. And what's going to happen if, the spot price is more or less stable, right? So again, ignoring price return, which would say the spot price is not stable, but looking at a stable spot price, well, then you have a group of people that are taking long positions as part of their portfolio initiatives, right? So it's just a commodity investment in terms of alternative investments, and they're agreeing to buy at 9, and then when they get to the expiration of the contract, the actual spot price is 10. Hey, hallelujah, right? I can buy at 9 from the contract, sell to 10 for 10 in the market, and I have a positive return, and then I do the same thing again, right? So I enter it again. So the point is that when we're down here in this backwardized market, okay, the roll yield, okay, which I'm going to put RY, is going to be positive. Okay? On the other hand, if we were to go to where we had markets in contango, then the roll yield is going to be negative up here, right? So this is where it's going to be negative. I'll put a negative sign. Well, the backstory to this is that the commodities market has been unusually backwardized. So what we've seen is a much greater prevalence of this backwardization in these commodity futures markets than what we would expect from any of our normal pricing models. So there's been a group of investors who essentially advocate that, hey, these collateralized commodity futures ought to be considered an asset class. And, if you read between the lines, I think what the author of the article is saying is, yeah, you feel that way because we've had this uncharacteristic backwardization, which has given you these positive roll yields, which has been pumping up portfolio returns. But you could also argue that backwardization is going to turn into contango. That is, we're going to have different players in the market, and those roll yields are going to be negative, and then you're not going to be quite so excited about this as an asset class. So anyway, the point here is, if you and the lesson to learn is twofold. One, if you have the producers of the commodity as the force from the hedgers, that is, they're the ones that are selling in the futures market, then you're going to have a backwardized market. Okay, if that market is backwardized in an uncharacteristic sense, then the roll yield from commodity investing is going to be positive. And of course, if you are a portfolio manager, having this positive roll yield is going to be something that you're going to think is a good thing. So anyway, so that is the roll yield, and being able to explain what it is and where it comes from, I think are maybe the most important thing in this reading. Maybe not, it's certainly not the only thing, but I would make sure I understood what was going on there. All right, so if we're looking at a commodity index and we're trying to mimic that with a commodity future strategy or any sort of commodity derivative strategy, is that an active strategy? Well, of course it's an active strategy. Okay, so the derivative is always going to have a finite life. So the manager of the portfolio who's trying to implement this is going to have to decide which maturities to use and when to roll them over. Okay, and also you're going to have to think in terms of portfolio weights. How are you going to match that? Which securities you're going to post as collateral? All those types of things. So this is clearly an active management strategy. There's nothing passive about a commodities position, commodities position achieved through derivative contracts anyway, inside your portfolio. So a couple of questions to follow on this. So what's the relationship of the futures price to the spot price if a commodity market is in contango versus backwardation? So very basic definitions here. So think about it real quick. Contango means what? Backwardation means what? Okay, so contango means that the futures price is greater than the spot price, and backwardation is just the opposite. Spot is greater than the future. And then how do we get these two situations is the next question. So in terms of if the dominant demand for hedging using a futures contract are producers of the commodity. then the roll yield will most likely be A, positive, B, negative, C, indeterminate. Well, again, if we have the producers of the commodity, that's the farmers that are growing the wheat, okay, they're long in the cash or spot market, so they got to short in the futures market, right? So the producers of the commodity got to sell, so that means that they are the dominant force from the hedging side. If you're selling, you're increasing supply. If you're increasing supply, you're driving down price. Well, if the price of if the futures price is below the spot price, okay, and really to understand this, we'd have to say in an uncharacteristic way, but nonetheless, just let's say it's below, okay, well then you are going to get this positive roll yield. So if you got all these hedgers that are driving price down, okay, that doesn't mean you're shorting, right? We're still talking about and taking long positions to access the underlying impact of the economy on these commodity prices. But if the other users in there are predominantly the producers of the commodity, where they're driving the price down, they're making the market to be backwardized, or they're causing the market to be backwardized, and then you come in and say, okay, now I'm going to maintain a derivatives position here to gain access to the underlying commodity. Well, every time you roll that over, then you may be getting a little bump to your yield. So you're getting a positive roll yield, and you're likely to think that that is a good thing, right? Anyway, so quick little reading. A few things to know there about price. You know, we've isolated price return, we've isolated collateral return. Those would also be considered. Collateral return would normally be positive. Price return could be positive or negative, but both the positive or negative returns from the price yield are going to be balanced by positive collateral returns, and if the market is backwardized, which has been uncharacteristically so in recent decades maybe, then we would see that we'd have these positive roll yields, and that has been a good thing if you've been engaging in those positions. So quick little reading, not much to get here, but make sure you understand what the roll yield is, where it comes from, when it's going to be positive, and when it's going to be negative. Good luck with this material.